It's a fantastic day today. I'm here with Manoj Kewalramani. And Manoj, you have a fantastic newsletter that is tracking people's daily, really distilling the news that is coming from the people's daily, making sense of it, also translating it for the people that cannot speak Mandarin. You are with the CSIS, as far as I understand, for the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the think tank in US. You're also running your own think tank, chairperson of the Indo-Pacific Studies program at a public policy center in India. And then you wrote an interesting book in 2020, Smokeless War, China's Quest for Geopolitical Dominance. So fantastic to have you on, Manoj. Good to be here.
Thank you so much, Armin. Just a bit of a correction. I'm with the think tank, the Takshashila Institution in India, which is where I chair the Indo-Pacific work. And I'm a non-resident associate with CSIS. But my primary base is Bangalore, India.
Yes. Okay. Perfect. All right. Then we have this. Good. So, and we were just talking before we hit the record button that one big part of your work is really deciphering and making sense about the narratives inside of China, because it is quite interesting that from a Western perspective, if you look at the Western, coverage, so to say, it seems that everything is very opaque, that like it's very hard to make sense of it. And you have the opposite view of that, right? You think, well, it's not a black box. We can make sense of it. We just maybe have to apply a different mental model or a different framework. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I actually find this definition of the Chinese information ecosystem as a black box quite limiting. I can understand that there is tremendous opacity in the system. This is a party state where the party is sort of deeply interlinked with the state, and it's very difficult to sort of draw those threads apart. Often the discourse seems extremely tiring, boring. The language is very stodgy, and it doesn't seem to really convey anything. And often people don't know where to go because you feel like there's one line of thought which is constantly there in the ecosystem. And that's why people generally tend to say that, look, the Chinese ecosystem, information ecosystem is a black box. We don't really understand where the policy is moving. And we have absolutely no idea of where politics is moving, how elites are moving. My view on this is that I think that's a very limiting view of approaching the ecosystem. If you think of the Chinese information ecosystem rather as a stained glass window, with some really interesting creative artwork on it, and you think of the sunlight sort of peering through it, and it casts a certain image. Now, when that happens, the sunlight also provides you some room to try and figure out what's happening behind the window. And it also tries to cast a certain image, which is what the party wants to do, right? The party wants to project something. And in its effort to try and project something, it allows you that little bit of space to try and figure out what's going on inside the country. Another reason why I think that, the information ecosystem is not a black box is quite simply for the practical feasibility of governing a country as large as China, right? You've got a party which has nearly 100 million members. You've got this massive country, you've got this massive structure of central government control and, provincial governments, municipal governments, local governments down the road. And the central government wants to be able to implement certain kinds of policies that are its preferred policies. And therefore, it requires local governments to act. So how do you communicate with at least these 100 million carders? Right. You need to communicate in the open, right? You can't be having red phones on every desk with secret messages being sent across. And that's the function that party state media largely plays. Apart from amplifying certain messages, cultivating political legitimacy, it also tries to communicate policy priorities. And increasingly under Xi Jinping, it tries to communicate methods to achieve those policy objectives. So the job of an analyst, I believe, is to try and look at this information ecosystem, parse out, sort of distill the wheat from the chaff and try to figure out where exactly are actual policy messages being sent, what are the warnings, what are the requirements, and how those messages are being interpreted by cadres at different levels, and then look at how policy is being implemented to try and figure out, say, does the data triangulate with the goals and the objectives? So I think that's what we can do and there's lots of information available to try and do that. One can question whether the data is necessary, the data the Chinese state puts out is accurate. I think the Chinese government itself has been quite open about the fact that its data is a guide as opposed to necessarily accurate measures. So if you look at trend lines, you can make sense of actually what's going on, what the policy priorities are. So that's how I think it's much more helpful to think about the open source ecosystem rather than thinking about it as a black box, because that just means that you fold your hands and you say, well, there's nothing that we can do about it.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting because I remember this a few years ago. We had the China dream, right? And this word was introduced, but like actually, there wasn't much to it. So people were actually figuring it out along the way. There was a lot of discussion. And I suppose today it's not different, right? So you still have these catchphrases, these big, let's say, themes, and they are discussed, and we do get new signals then that move in, as you said, like move in one direction or another, so we can establish trends. So what I'm wondering is, what kind of big catchphrases would you say should we pay attention today?
I think that's a really, so at present, I would say that obviously high quality development, the development of a new development pattern, dual circulation, the community of a common destiny for mankind. These are the kind of current catchphrases which are, really prominent. Self-reliance in science and technology, science and technology being the driving force, or innovation being the driving force for future economic growth. So these are your sort of catchphrases today, along with the three initiatives that have been launched: the Global Security Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, and the Global Civilization Initiative. Again, I think it's really useful to think of all these catchphrases and think of all these ideas within the frame of Chinese politics. And it's useful for people who approach all of this to try and understand how Chinese political discourse functions, and how Chinese politics functions, given the peculiar nature of the party-state ecosystem. The top leader generally tends to articulate a certain vision. So in this case, Xi Jinping, he's articulating a certain vision, which, say, the community of common destiny for mankind was something that he articulated in 2013. To gradually over the years, this rather vague but benign sounding idea starts to get filled in as different scholars interpret it within the context of China's interests, its capabilities, its capacities. You also start to think of, well, what is it that we want to achieve when we create this community? So that process of interpretation happens, that process of thinking through intellectual discourse takes place, that process of capability assessment takes place. And this is iterative, right? You're also looking at what's happening in the world. After nearly 10 years of articulating that community of common destiny for mankind, today we have this framework where these three new initiatives that I talked about, Civilization Initiative, Development Initiative, and Security Initiative, are being argued as the three core pillars of that community of common destiny of mankind. So what one needs to understand that these are iterative themes. They get interpreted over a period of time based on circumstances and based on the priority of the leader. And gradually you get sort of meat on the bones so that you can try and understand what's going on. So that's why the discourse often can seem quite vacuous, because there's very little new that's being said, but people are repeating slogans. But over a period of time, I think it's useful to just see what's being added under the slogan. What are the different policy initiatives that are being taken and how those are being added within the slogan. And that's when you try to sort of parse through and say, hey, okay, this is what Xi Jinping is trying to communicate now when he says community of common destiny, or when he says global security initiative. And the same thing happened with Belt and Road. I was in China, living in China, when the Belt and Road initiative was announced. For the first 1 year, I can quite confidently say that very few people knew what it meant. I was working with Chinese state media at that point of time, and I remember that we were asked to do stories on the theme of Belt and Road. And when we asked, well, what does it mean? We were told, well, why can't you just do stories of camels along the Silk Road historically? And we'll figure it out when we figure it out. So it took some time for that process to come through. And I think that's because the leader argues for a vision. The vision is purposefully vague because it evades responsibility, but it also allows others to innovate and think what can be encapsulate within this vision. Because if the leader gives you a very clear-cut, certain set of points to follow, you won't innovate, and he won't know what all can be achieved. So it's purposefully ambiguous. People fill in material into it. Sometimes it often goes it goes bad, as we've seen in many cases of Belt and Road projects, where there's been really overpricing of things and things like that. But sometimes it delivers, right? So I think that's the process in which these sort of slogans operate.
It's very interesting because, I mean, when you talked about the meat, right? So meat is gonna, put step by step. There's a lot of discussion. Then we put meat to these phrases. So we have these three pillars that you mentioned, which are really right now the core. What's the meat that you think, okay, this is really kind of, worth looking at? And when I say that, I mean, I do see that a lot of solutions that are proposed by China, for example, recently with, or not that recent, but like with the Ukraine peace, deal, or when there was like this suggestion, it wasn't really taken very serious, was taking as very kind of, okay, maybe there's this interest or this interest, like, what other solutions are out there that might not be that much discussed in the Western media ecosystem?
Yeah, I think that so on the Ukraine proposal that was put out, or the China's position paper on Ukraine, I agree. I don't think that there was anything substantive being offered in that proposal. Uh, I don't think Beijing is particularly interested in getting its hands dirty in that conflict. I think it's quite wary of getting engaged. Yet there are costs, because of its relationship with Russia, because of perceptions in Europe, and of course, costs in terms of downstream effects such as food security, energy security, and so on and so forth. So I think that its goal is to try and make sure that that conflict doesn't have spillover effects.
Sure.
And as much as possible, if Europe and Russia can arrive at some sort of a new agreement of sort of a security architecture for Europe, which limits the scope of American influence. That would be sort of Beijing's best case outcome. And its diplomacy has been around that. But in terms of sort of, encouraging the Russians to immediately cease fire and do things like that, I think Beijing's been quite cautious. And I think there's also a case of, well, what capability does it have, and does it really have the kind of influence to force the Russians to engage in a ceasefire? So I think that, therefore, I don't think the position paper really offered a solution. It reiterated the argument that, look, NATO and Russia need to arrive at some sort of an agreement between each other. And that agreement needs to essentially, from Beijing's perspective, strengthen European strategic autonomy vis-a-vis the United States. But on the other three initiatives, I think it's worth understanding why Xi Jinping put forward these three initiatives. For the longest time, he's been, in his speeches and in his commentaries in state media, interpreting his speeches. We've heard these terms, this phrase that the world today is turbulent and is undergoing tremendous change. The balance of power is shifting from the West to the East, although the West still remains dominant. And in this churn and in this process, the world is facing four deficits, right? The deficit of development, the deficit of peace, the deficit of governance, and the deficit of trust. And he has argued that GDI, GSI, and GCI are essentially an effort to try and plug these deficits. Now, why does he want to plug these deficits? Well, because development from his point of view leads to security challenges, and therefore China today has more capacity to try and address the development deficit, so it can contribute something more in terms of global development. He's taken into account the criticism that BRI has received for being unilateral, for essentially being an extension of Chinese foreign policy and exporting Chinese overcapacity, while it has had positive effects in terms of infrastructure in third countries. So therefore, he's linked the GDI to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And therefore, the domains in which GDI operates are far sort of low cost when compared to BRI. And they are in line with Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. It also sort of allows China to become a development partner in domains where it does not have comparative advantages. So BRI focused on infrastructure, energy, which are areas where China has comparative advantage. GDI focuses on things like food security, on education, on water, sanitation, health, and vaccines, which again are not as these big ticket projects like they are under BRI, but they have an impact directly on people So this is also sort of a image rehabilitation exercise while trying to address
and also what China
development
would like to
deficits.
progress, all of the areas that you just mentioned, right? Like, so it's
Exactly. Yeah.
natural. Okay.
Exactly. So it finds the sort of value in this. GSI, on the other hand, is from my sort of perspective, is primarily aimed at disincentivizing other countries from participating in closer security cooperation with the US, particularly as China feels that there is a containment strategy that the US is developing. So a lot of it has been around narrative around trying to push back against the idea of collective security with the idea of indivisible security. And along with that, of course, China is pitching to become a closer partner for countries, whether it's in terms of weapons trade, whether it's in terms of defense training, law enforcement cooperation, and so on and so forth. And some of these are legitimate domains where countries have concerns and China can augment their capacity. And finally, the Global Civilization Initiative, to me, that's a pushback on what it sees is the values narrative from the West, this idea of democracy versus authoritarianism, and therefore sort of reinterpreting basic values, fundamental values, or what it believes are the West says universal values, and redefining them as common values, and then saying that, hey, look, there are these certain common values that we all share, such as freedom, such as democracy, and saying that, look, these common values can be interpreted by each of us based on our civilizational experience, and no one should have the right to tell us how you are interpreting and implementing this. And your civilization experience and your national conditions determine these. So again, in a way, it's sort of proposing a new structure for world order in some ways. And these initiatives sort of come together to do that, to try and provide an alternative in some way to what it sees as the US-led Western liberal international order, which it believes is obviously weakening, as it says that the power is transitioning from the West to the East. So that's how I interpret what's happening with GDI, GSI, and GCI.
Which of these initiatives do you think has been so far like the most successful? And also like which kind of aspect of it?
Yeah, I think without a doubt, the Global Development Initiative has been most successful. It is the oldest of the three. It was launched in September 2021. And it's been very smartly implemented, I would argue. I think the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has led the implementation of this initiative. They've got about 70 countries that have joined what is called a group of friends of GDI at the UN. Under that group of friends, there was a first batch of 50 projects that was announced. Several of those have been completed. So these are, like I said, say vaccine provision in a certain country, building of health training in a certain country, trying to ensure that you provide building of a school, providing of books and things like that, right? So much low cost projects. Many of these are implemented with say the UN agencies. So the UNDP is a partner in a number of these. Chinese, the SIDCA, which is the Chinese Development Agency, is also the lead in this. And right now, I think the GDI project pool, a couple of weeks ago, there was a report put out on the GDI by the Chinese government. The project pool for GDI is now at about 200. So it's expanding. And of course, you've got a bunch of countries that have committed to joining a group under GDI, right? Group of friends. This is not the case with GSI or GCI, right? In those, I think Beijing itself is quite cautious about not trying to form a group under GSI particular, because then it seems like you're mirroring what you're criticizing,
Right.
security-based camp formation. So therefore, GSI is much more amorphous and largely been around rhetoric pushing back, American participation or participation with the United States in terms of security. But other aspects have been sort of clubbed under GSI to demonstrate that it's been successful. So the agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia was hailed as a success of GSI. The fact is that conversation between Iran and Saudi Arabia far predates any discussion of GSI. It's just that China was a last-minute entrant in that conversation, and it was the Saudis who actually proposed that the Chinese get involved for their own purposes, right? So it was not like it was Chinese proactiveness. The fact that the Chinese took the bait and ran with it is a sign of Chinese proactiveness, but it is not a sign that because GSI was announced, China was proactively going to try and resolve disputes around the world. I don't think it's going to do that. I don't think it's interested in sending its security forces to keep the peace unilaterally in other parts of the world. So therefore, I think GSI is still fairly immature. There's lots that needs to happen, and it is likely to remain amorphous. GCI is interesting because I think elements of it will remain, will be sort of, you will have joint declarations on and joint agreements on. So, for example, just today, in fact, there was a report of the China-Arab political parties dialogue, which ended with an agreement on GCI. I'm still not clear what that agreement is, but I presume it sort of is agreeing on certain basic values that, hey, look, no, there should be no external interference in our internal governance. We should be allowed to interpret certain values based on our traditional culture and based on our national conditions. And in that sense, GCI is good. So GCI to me, again, will, parts of it will be common declarations. And this is not new. In 2017, there was a South-South dialogue on human rights that was held in Beijing that led to a Beijing Declaration on Human Rights, which supported the idea that, look, human rights are not universal. They are universal, but they are also particular. So nobody can be telling you that there is a certain universal definition of human rights. You can interpret them the way you want to. So these are the kinds of sort of value frameworks that I think GCI will try to build on. So it will remain amorphous to some degree, but you will see a bunch of activities around values, around youth cooperation, around education, around sports, around television, news, entertainment, and say around restoration of archaeological sites and things like that, right? So I think GCI encompasses all of these. So therefore, some of it will be concrete agreements, but some of it will remain amorphous in terms of a value discourse.
It's very interesting and brings us a little bit to, because it is to a certain extent like an alternative to just the values that come from traditionally democratic societies, which kind of brings us a little bit to India then. And, you're an observer in this, you're uniquely positioned to, provide a view to where we are at in the relationship, because we've come a long way, I think, especially the relationship with the US/Western world, and India is now, well, I would even say like, it's a little bit in a bubble as it seems, because at least like from the Western narrative newspaper perspective, it's full of it, from The Economist to the Financial Times, and India is now really hailed as the savior and hedge against China. So, like from, obviously you know this narrative, you are looking at the medias in both systems, you know the ecosystem, the discussions, like what stands out to you in the India, China slash US kind of narratives that are going around, and is there anything particular that we should highlight?
I think the first thing around the India-China dyad one needs to think about is, and I don't think people realize this, particularly people in the West, we often talk about the sinking of the US-China relationship. But even then, in this past few months, you've seen intense diplomacy between the two countries. You've seen Blinken visiting, you've seen Janet Yellen visiting, you've got John Kerry right now in China, and you'll have the Commerce Secretary visiting soon. And you had Xi Jinping and Biden meeting in Bali in November 2022. The last time that the Indian Prime Minister and Xi Jinping spoke one-on-one was in October 2019. The entire pandemic, there was no conversation between the two men. The only conversation that took place since then bilaterally was a brief 2-minute exchange in Bali during the festivities in the night, where the Indian Prime Minister went up to the Chinese president and they shook hands and they had a very brief exchange. This is happening at a time when both the countries are locked in essentially confrontation on the border. In 2020, there was the Chinese forces had sort of stepped over what was customarily believed to be India's line of actual control. And that led to a standoff in many domains. That led to eventually an aggressive fight breaking out in June 2020, with the death of 20 Indian soldiers and 4 Chinese soldiers. This was the first time that you saw deaths on the boundary between India and China since 1947. Oh, sorry, not 1947, 1967. So it's a real, flashpoint that has opened up. And since then, the relationship has essentially nosedived. So in the India-China relationship is perhaps far more fragile today than any other bilateral relationship that China has. And again, it's two countries which have a disputed border. Now, within this context, if you place the competition that's taking place between the US and China, and India's own goals of wanting to strengthen itself because it has serious security concerns on the north with China and on the west with Pakistan, and it has serious security concerns in terms of its own growth and development, right? Serious strategic goals. It finds a much more able and willing partner in the United States today than it has found ever in its history. The India-US relationship for the last 20 odd years has been deepening. Ever since in 1998, the United States placed sanctions on India after India conducted its second nuclear test. And 2 years after that, Clinton visited India and the relationship started to change dramatically. So there's been an upward trajectory of that relationship. And today, that's on an accelerated path. And we have Xi Jinping to thank for that, because Chinese policies have facilitated a greater sort of strategic alignment between these two sides. So all of the things that we're hearing today about, India being an alternative to China, I think those are not new ideas in many ways, but they've been given new salience because of not just India's rapid growth, but also this sort of geopolitical environment, which, to be honest, Xi Jinping has facilitated. So a lot of us in India have to be very thankful to Xi Jinping for actually creating those conditions for India and opening those doors, which otherwise were opening, but they were far slower, in terms of how they was moving. And I think you can see that in the recent visit by the Indian Prime Minister to the US. When he was going to the US, I don't think anyone of us who were tracking this relationship, some of us in my organization, we'd argued that India should join the Artemis Accords and partner with the US on space. But it was not even on the agenda. But it was one of the biggest outcomes from the visit that India did sign on to the Artemis Accords. And next year, you're going to see an Indian astronaut going to the International Space Station with American astronauts. So I think that's an example of how rapidly the relationship is deepening. And again, it's a product of this strategic alignment. Now, if say China was to have a rethink of its ties with India and engage in some sort of outreach, try to pull back from the boundary, try to go back to negotiated agreements which had kept the peace for well over 30, 40 years. I think that what you will see from India is still continuing to deepening its partnership with the West, but it will remain cautious about aligning militarily. India has so far remained extremely cautious aligning militarily. The Quad is not a military alignment. Yeah. I think India has been quite categorical that we don't want it to become a military alignment. And Beijing believes that it is, drifting towards military alignment, because if you're building interoperability in other ways, the Quad just provides you a platform to actually leverage that interoperability. So I think India will continue to remain very cautious of that because it wants to stabilize the relationship with China. Yet, I think this direction that we have embarked on in terms of our proximity to the West is unlikely to change. So it's a difficult balancing act for Delhi to perform, but it will try to perform this in this manner. Because at the end of the day, you can't change geography. You can't change your neighbors. Right. So you're going to be neighbors with China, until perhaps millions of years, until the continents drift again somewhere. So you're going to have to learn to live with each other. But that doesn't mean that you don't grow and you don't secure yourself.
And do you see any kind of pragmatic kind of discussions on this when you kind of talk to people? Also narratives in the media, like, okay, we have this border dispute. But apart from that, do you see like discussions that, we see some sort of change or reapproachment or whatever you want to call it?
I think in India, the public discourse on China is far more critical than the official discourse. So I think the policy making, the policymakers in India, I think, are far more cognizant of the challenges of the worsening relationship. The public discourse is sort of imbued with a strong sense of nationalism. And therefore it's far more aggressive and sometimes unreasonably aggressive. But then that's the product of free media. But the policy discourse, I think,
Oh,
is
in
far
China,
more
it's the
nuanced.
same.
Exactly. So, yes, exactly. That's not even the product of free media. But no, I mean, like in terms of the policy discourse, I think it's much more calm. It's much more reasoned. And I think there is a desire for, of course, arriving at a rebalanced relationship with China. But you know, India as a democracy, it's very difficult for politicians to, brush under the rug the death of 20 soldiers, and what that sort of creates. It's very difficult to, every time there is some sort of escalation of the boundary, news breaks, and it fuels this anger. And again, it goes back to sort of India-China history, right? We had a war with each other in 1962, which India lost. And that war has impacted Indian psyche quite clearly over the last 50, 60 years, because it's left this imprint that it is something that we lost because of Chinese perfidy. At one hand, Beijing kept talking about India and China being brothers. At the other hand, it was amassing forces. Obviously, the reality is much more complex. But that sense of Chinese perfidy has had long imprint on the Indian imagination. And what the last 3 years have done with the standoff in 2020 is it's reinforced that. And of course, the Chinese media has been an actor in reinforcing that. Going back to even 2017, India and China had a standoff involving a third country, Bhutan, where their borders have a tri-junction. And it was a 70-odd day standoff. During that entire period of time, the Indian government, I think, issued two statements which were very calm, very sane, saying, look, we want to calm things down. And the Chinese side, on a daily basis, had aggressive statements criticizing India. Chinese state media, Xinhua, in fact, ran a extremely racist video talking about Indians being stupid. All that fuels public imagination, because we're no longer in an era where what you say within your borders stays within your borders, right? What you say, there's no distinction between this is my domestic narrative and this is my external narrative. And I think in doing that, Beijing essentially lost a generation of Indians. Because if you just go back a few years before that, 2008, 2009, you had an Indian prime minister imagining the development of our financial capital, Mumbai. And he would say that I want to make Mumbai into the next Shanghai, not London, not New York, not Paris, Shanghai. We are far from there, where today we don't even imagine any, So Chinese development had this impact on Indian thinking. And it's eroded because of Chinese security actions over the last 6 years, but more intently since 2020.
Interesting. Well, maybe it's Singapore now. Um, okay, great. Manoj, so before we wrap this up, I already mentioned your newsletter. That's fantastic. So apart from Cassandra, where can people follow your work?
Oh, you can LinkedIn, Twitter, and of course to check out the Takshashila website. I think the think tank does some tremendous work across domains, which our approach is to look at future-looking policy issues as opposed to current and the past. So this is where you'll find things like where we're talking about space, where we're talking about AI, and things where we're talking about genetics. So you'll find all these cutting-edge ideas on the think tank, where you'll also find the work that we do on geopolitics and security and on the Indo-Pacific.
Thank you so much, Manoj. That was fantastic.
Thank you. Take care.